Hi everyone, these are my notes on what antimicrobial drugs target. So when someone has a bacterial infection, we give them antibiotics, and different antibiotic drugs have different targets. So if we're focusing on bacteria being our microbe, and if you just look here in black, I drew out what a typical, very simple bacteria might look like. So bacteria have their DNA, which is that they have a cell membrane, a cell wall, and then the transcription and translation happens. Remember, transcription and translation is when we convert DNA to RNA and RNA to protein. Bacteria have a 70S ribosome, which consists of a 50S large subunit and a 30S large subunit. And then there's a lot of metabolic pathways, which are my little stars in green. So if we just focus on what a typical bacteria looks like, this is the simplest form of drawing out bacteria. Okay, so now we're going to talk about different drug targets. So some drugs, some antibiotics work, they harm bacteria by targeting different things. And drugs can either be bactericidal or bacteriostatic. When we say that a drug is bactericidal, it kills the bacteria. When we say it's bacteriostatic, it stops the bacteria from growing. So some drugs work by inhibiting cell wall synthesis. So basically, you're targeting that right there, your cell wall. So these drugs inhibit cell wall synthesis, and typically cell walls are made up of peptidoglycan. So these drugs affect peptidoglycan. They're bactericidal, so drugs that are in the class of inhibiting cell wall synthesis kill bacteria because bacteria need that cell wall for protection. Examples of drugs that inhibit cell wall synthesis are beta-lactam drugs. So these are drugs that have a beta-lactam ring, such as penicillin, glycopeptide drugs, such as vancomycin, bastracin, which is an ointment. And there's more. So I want you to go watch the lecture and know the details of everything. I'm just summarizing it here. And these drugs are typically narrow to broad spectrum. So some drugs that inhibit cell wall synthesis are narrow, meaning they just target a small spectrum of bacteria. Some are broad, meaning that they target many different types of bacteria. So keep that in mind. So there's drugs, again, that inhibit cell wall synthesis. So for example, if you're being prescribed penicillin, when you're taking that penicillin is stopping bacteria from being able to make their cell wall, and therefore it's killing the bacteria so that your body can recover from the infection. Okay. Next class of drugs, some drugs work by inhibiting protein synthesis. So we learned in class all about how cells make protein. And remember, to make protein, we go through transcription and then translation. And with translation, one of the most important components involved are ribosomes. So when we said what is the function of ribosomes, we learned that ribosomes make protein. So these drugs, when we say they inhibit protein synthesis, they're affecting translation and or the 70S ribosome. Keep in mind, we as humans, as eukaryotes, have an 80S ribosome. So these drugs are great because they affect the bacteria but don't necessarily affect our cells. So these drugs affect the 70S ribosome of bacteria. Some of the drugs in this class are narrow spectrum, some are broad spectrum. These drugs are bacteriostatic, meaning they stop bacteria from further growing. They do not kill the bacteria, but by blocking translation and affecting the ribosome, you just slow down the growth of bacteria, which is great because then your immune system can come and really get at the bacteria. So all of the drugs in the inhibit protein synthesis class are bacteriostatic, except aminoglycosides are bactericidal. So these ones do actually kill the bacteria, but the majority of them are bacteriostatic. Examples of these are chloramphenicol, tetracyclines, macrolides, aminoglycosides such as streptomycin. So those are drugs that inhibit protein synthesis. Okay, another class of drugs for targeting when someone has a bacterial infection are those that inhibit nucleic acid synthesis. So nucleic acids are DNA or RNA. So these drugs either affect DNA, such as DNA replication, maybe they affect transcription, such as the conversion of DNA to RNA, or they affect RNA. So once we have that mRNA molecule made, these are broad spectrums, meaning they target many different types of bacteria. So maybe you have someone in a hospital and they have an infection and you haven't yet determined if they have a gram positive or gram negative infection. So you prescribe them drugs that inhibit nucleic acid synthesis because they target both. They're bactericidal, meaning they kill bacteria, and examples of these are fluoroquinones and metronidazole. Just fluoroquinones here, I misspelled it, but you guys can look up your lecture to see how it's spelled. And here, the fourth class of antimicrobial targets are drugs that interfere with the plasma membrane synthesis. Now, these drugs are a bit tricky because when we look at our cells also have a plasma membrane that's very similar to the bacteria's plasma membrane. So with these drugs, we have to target very specific, unique things in the bacteria's plasma membrane. They're narrow spectrum, and these drugs are bactericidal because if you affect the plasma membrane, you will kill the bacteria. Finally, the last class of antimicrobial drug targets are drug targets that inhibit different metabolic processes. Now, in the lecture, I talk about the folate pathway, but know that there's many different metabolic pathways, and research is looking into different metabolic pathways that we can target in bacteria. So an example of an essential metabolic pathway that these drugs can target is the folate pathway. So without the folate pathway, bacteria cannot make nucleotides. So these class of drugs are harmful to bacteria. They're bacteriostatic, so they stop bacteria from growing because if you don't make more nucleotides, you cannot grow. They're broad spectrum. They target many different types of bacteria, both gram-negative and gram-positive. And examples of these drugs are sulfa drugs. So here is my summary of antibiotic drug targets. Please go and I hope that you write these notes and then you go back in the lecture and you add all the little details under each bullet point. So under number 1, add the specific drugs that are there. Under number 2, add the specific aminoglycoside drugs. So just go through all of it, and I hope that this just puts it all in perspective for you.